Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of the most absolutely bizarre fruits that medieval people were obsessed with. And honestly, when I first learned about the medlar, I thought someone was pranking me. We're talking about a fruit that you literally cannot eat until it's basically rotting. Like, that's not a bug, that's a feature. What fascinates me most about this topic is how something so weird and gross sounding was actually considered a delicacy for over 1,000 years. The medlar is proof that medieval people had some seriously different ideas about what counted as good food. So hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously weird food history. And drop a comment letting me know if you've ever heard of medlars before tonight. I'm genuinely curious because most people have never even seen one. Get comfortable. Maybe grab a normal fruit that doesn't need to rot first. And let's dive into the strange world of medieval fruit obsession. Picture this. You're walking through a medieval monastery garden, and the monks are all excited about these brown, lumpy fruits that look like they've already gone bad. But here's the thing. These aren't spoiled fruits. They're medlars, and they're exactly where they need to be. The medlar, or Mespilus germanica if you want to get all scientific about it, is literally the weirdest fruit success story in European history. We're talking about a fruit that was so popular in medieval times that kings mandated it be grown in royal orchards. But today, most people have never even heard of it. The ancient origins of this fruit are actually pretty incredible. Medlars have been around for over 30 years, which means people were dealing with this bizarre, rotting fruit situation since before Rome was even a thing. The fruit originated in Southwest Asia and Southeastern Europe, where ancient civilizations figured out that sometimes the best things in life require a little patience and a strong stomach. By the time the Romans got their hands on medlars, they were already spreading them throughout their empire like some kind of weird fruit evangelists. What's absolutely wild is how the Romans basically introduced medlars to Western Europe, and instead of people going, "This is gross, why would we eat rotting fruit?" they went, "This is amazing. We need more of this." The medlar became so popular that it was a staple in monastic orchards throughout the Middle Ages. Monks, who were supposed to be focused on spiritual matters, were out there carefully tending to their medlar trees like they were precious jewels. There's something hilariously ironic about holy men being obsessed with fruit that has to rot before you can eat it. The royal endorsement of medlars is where this story gets really interesting. Charlemagne, who was basically the most powerful ruler in medieval Europe, specifically mandated that medlars be grown in royal gardens. We're talking about a guy who was conquering territories and establishing an empire, but he took time out of his busy schedule to make sure people were growing weird, rotting fruit. Henry VII of England was another medlar enthusiast, which means that royal dinner parties featured fruits that looked like they belonged in the compost pile. The fact that medlars were considered high-class food is honestly mind-blowing when you think about it. In a time when fresh fruit was often a luxury, the rich and powerful were choosing to eat fruit that had to be stored until it was soft and mushy. This wasn't a peasant food that people ate out of desperation. This was fancy fruit that graced the tables of kings and nobles. Imagine being a medieval dinner guest and watching royalty get excited about brown, squishy fruit that smelled like it was past its prime. The spread of medlar cultivation across medieval Europe was incredibly systematic. Monastic communities were essentially running a medieval fruit distribution network, sharing medlar varieties and cultivation techniques across vast distances. Each monastery would have its own medlar orchards, and monks would trade different varieties with other religious communities. This created a kind of international medlar exchange system that helped spread the fruit throughout Christian Europe. What really gets me is how medlars became embedded in medieval culture at every level. Rich people had them in their private gardens. Monasteries grew them for sustenance and trade, and even common people knew about medlars and their weird ripening requirements. This wasn't some obscure fruit that only food weirdos knew about. This was mainstream medieval cuisine. Children grew up knowing that medlars had to rot before you could eat them, and nobody thought this was strange. The historical importance of medlars goes beyond just being a popular fruit. They represented a completely different approach to food and seasonality that we've basically lost in modern times. Medieval people were comfortable with foods that required patience, that didn't look perfect, and that challenged modern assumptions about freshness. The medlar was a symbol of understanding that sometimes the best things come to those who wait, even if what you're waiting for looks like it's rotting. The cultivation techniques that medieval people developed for medlars were surprisingly sophisticated. They knew exactly when to harvest the fruit, how to store it for optimal ripening, and how to tell when it was ready to eat. This wasn't just throw it in a corner and hope for the best. This was scientific fruit management that required real expertise. Master gardeners would spend years learning the art of medlar cultivation, and their knowledge was passed down through generations. Looking at this whole medlar phenomenon from a modern perspective, it's honestly fascinating how a fruit that was so central to medieval life has become almost completely forgotten. We're talking about something that was mandated by kings, grown by monks, and enjoyed by everyone from nobles to commoners. But today, you'd be lucky to find someone who's even heard of medlars, let alone tasted one. It's like an entire chapter of food history just disappeared. Now we're getting to the absolutely wild part, the medlar's ripening process, which is honestly the most bizarre thing I've ever encountered in food history. We're talking about a fruit that literally has to rot before you can eat it, and I mean that in the most literal sense possible. What absolutely blows my mind is how medieval people figured out this insane process and decided, yes, this is exactly what we want to do with our fruit. The medlar's ripening process is so weird that modern people would probably think it was spoiled and throw it away right at the moment when it's actually becoming edible. The technical term for this bizarre ripening process is bledding, which honestly sounds like something you'd hear in a medieval torture chamber. But bledding is actually a fascinating biological process, where the fruit's internal structure breaks down in a controlled way. Unlike normal fruits that ripen and become sweet while they're still firm, medlars have to go through this weird quasi-rotting phase, where they become soft, brown, and mushy. It's like the fruit is dying and becoming delicious at the same time. Here's what actually happens during the bledding process. And it's honestly kind of gross, but also scientifically fascinating. When medlars are first harvested, they're hard, astringent, and completely inedible. Like, they'll make your mouth pucker so hard you'll regret every life choice that led to that moment. The fruit contains high levels of tannins, which are the same compounds that make unripe persimmons taste terrible. But as the medlar goes through bledding, enzymes break down these tannins and convert the fruit starches into sugars. The visual transformation is absolutely dramatic and would probably terrify anyone who doesn't know what's happening. The fruit's skin turns from yellowish green to brown, and the flesh becomes soft and squishy. From the outside, a properly bledded medlar looks like it belongs in the compost bin, not on your dinner table. Medieval people had to develop serious trust in this process because everything about a bledded medlar screams, "This fruit has gone bad." There were actually two main methods for bledding medlars, and both required serious patience and skill. The first method involved leaving the fruit on the tree until the first frost, which would trigger the bledding process naturally. Medieval gardeners would watch their medlar trees carefully, waiting for that perfect moment when the fruit was ready to begin its transformation. The second method involved harvesting the fruit early and storing it in straw or sawdust until it bledded on its own. The storage method was probably the most common because it gave people more control over the timing. Medieval people would carefully arrange harvested medlars in layers of straw, creating what was essentially a fruit aging chamber. They'd check on the fruit regularly, looking for signs that the bledding process was beginning. This required real expertise because you had to catch the fruit at exactly the right moment. Too early and it was still inedible. Too late and it was actually rotten. The timing of bledding was absolutely crucial and required skills that took years to develop. A properly bledded medlar would be soft to the touch, but not mushy, brown on the outside, but still somewhat firm inside. Medieval fruit experts could tell by touch, smell, and appearance when a medlar was perfectly ready to eat. This wasn't just guesswork. This was serious food science that required real knowledge and experience. What's really wild is how the taste transformation was as dramatic as the visual one. A fresh medlar is astringent and basically inedible, but a properly bledded medlar tastes like a cross between applesauce and wine. Medieval people described the flavor as sweet, tangy, and complex, with notes that reminded them of cinnamon and other spices. The texture was often compared to custard or pudding, soft, creamy, and completely different from the hard, bitter fruit it started as. The seasonal timing of medlar bledding made it a perfect winter fruit for medieval people. Medlars were typically harvested in late autumn, then stored and allowed to bled throughout the winter months. This meant that when other fresh fruits were scarce, medlars were at their peak ripeness and flavor. Medieval people had fresh, sweet fruit available during the coldest months of the year, which was actually a huge luxury. The storage requirements for bledding medlars were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval people learned that temperature, humidity, and air circulation all affected the bledding process. They developed specialized storage areas that maintained optimal conditions for fruit aging. Some monasteries had dedicated medlar storage rooms where hundreds of fruits could be bledded simultaneously. This was basically medieval fruit warehousing, complete with quality control and timing systems. The psychological challenge of eating bledded medlars must have been enormous for people who weren't familiar with the process. Imagine being a medieval dinner guest and watching your host serve you fruit that looked completely rotten. You'd have to trust that they knew what they were doing and that this brown, mushy fruit was actually safe and delicious. Medieval people had to overcome some serious visual and mental barriers to enjoy medlars. The quality control aspects of medlar bledding were incredibly important. Medieval people had to distinguish between properly bledded fruit and actually rotten fruit, which required serious expertise. A medlar that had gone too far in the bledding process would be genuinely spoiled and potentially dangerous to eat. Master medlar handlers developed techniques for identifying the perfect moment when bledding was complete, but decay hadn't begun. What really impresses me is how this entire bledding process became normalized in medieval culture. Children grew up learning how to identify properly bledded medlars, and it was considered basic food knowledge. People would give each other advice about medlar storage and bledding techniques. This weird, complex fruit aging process became as natural as any other aspect of medieval food preparation. The modern world has basically lost all knowledge of medlar bledding, which is honestly kind of sad. We've become so focused on fresh, perfect-looking fruit that we've forgotten how delicious, properly aged fruit can be. Medieval people understood that some foods require patience, and that the best flavors sometimes come from processes that look questionable. The medlar's bledding process represents a completely different approach. Now we're getting to the absolutely hilarious part, the medieval nicknames for medlars. And honestly, I have to warn you that medieval people had zero filter when it came to naming things. We're talking about a fruit that got some of the most crude and inappropriate nicknames in the history of food, and the fact that these names were used in polite society is honestly incredible. What absolutely kills me about this topic is how medieval writers used medlars as metaphors in their literature, and the symbolism they chose was, let's just say, it was very adult-oriented. The medlar became a symbol for everything from aging to desire to life's more intimate pleasures, and medieval people were not subtle about it. The most famous nickname for medlars in medieval English was open arse, and yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. The fruit's distinctive shape, with its open cavity at the bottom surrounded by prominent sepals, apparently reminded medieval people of certain anatomical features. What's wild is that this wasn't just crude slang that people whispered about open arse, was the actual common name that people used in everyday conversation. Medieval cookbooks, garden manuals, and even religious texts would casually refer to medlars by this incredibly inappropriate name. The French weren't any more subtle with their medlar nicknames. They called medlars cul de chien, which translates to dog's bottom. And honestly, medieval French people were apparently just as obsessed with the fruit's suggestive appearance as the English. Other French nicknames included cul de cygne, monkey's bottom, and various other anatomical references that would make modern people blush. The fact that these names were used in polite society shows how different medieval attitudes toward language and propriety were. What's really fascinating is how different languages across Europe developed their own crude medlar nicknames. German speakers had their own versions, Italian dialects had theirs, and pretty much every European language developed some kind of inappropriate medlar name. This suggests that people everywhere were looking at meddlers and having the same basic reaction to their unusual shape. It's like medieval people across an entire continent collectively decided that this fruit looked like something naughty. The literary uses of meddlers are where this gets really interesting and surprisingly sophisticated. Geoffrey Chaucer, who was basically the Shakespeare of medieval England, used meddlers as symbols in his Canterbury Tales. He connected the fruit's need to rot before becoming edible with themes of aging, wisdom, and the idea that some things become more valuable with time. But Chaucer also used the meddler's crude nicknames and suggestive appearance for sexual metaphors that were barely disguised. Shakespeare took meddler symbolism even further in his plays, and honestly, the bard was not holding back. In As You Like It, he has characters make jokes about meddlers that are so layered with sexual innuendo that modern audiences often miss the references entirely. Shakespeare used meddlers to represent everything from sexual desire to the inevitability of aging, to the bittersweet nature of life's pleasures. The fact that a fruit could carry so much symbolic weight in literature shows how deeply embedded meddlers were in medieval culture. The religious symbolism of meddlars was equally complex and sometimes contradictory. Some medieval religious writers used meddlers as symbols of patience and spiritual ripening, suggesting that souls needed to blet through suffering before achieving spiritual sweetness. But other religious texts avoided meddlers entirely, probably because of their crude nicknames and sexual associations. This created a weird tension where the same fruit could represent both spiritual enlightenment and worldly temptation. What's really wild is how meddler nicknames influenced medieval humor and entertainment. Court jesters and traveling performers would make jokes about meddlers that played on their suggestive names and appearance. Medieval drinking songs included meddlar references that were so crude they would make modern comedians blush. The fruit became a source of comedy that allowed people to make sexual jokes in a socially acceptable way. The artistic representations of meddlars in medieval art often emphasized their suggestive qualities. Illuminated manuscripts would show meddlers in ways that highlighted their unusual shape and opening. Some medieval artists clearly knew exactly what they were doing when they depicted meddlars in certain contexts. This artistic tradition continued into the Renaissance, where meddlars appeared in paintings that were loaded with sexual symbolism. The social dynamics around meddlar names were fascinating and reveal a lot about medieval attitudes. People could use crude meddlar nicknames in polite company because they were just talking about fruit, but everyone understood the double meanings. This created a kind of socially acceptable way to be inappropriate that doesn't really exist in modern culture. Medieval people had developed this elaborate system of sexual innuendo based around a fruit. The educational aspects of meddlar nicknames were probably pretty entertaining. Medieval children would learn about meddlers and their various names, which means parents and teachers had to explain why this fruit had such crude nicknames. This probably led to some interesting conversations about anatomy, language, and social conventions. The meddler became an accidental sex education tool that helped medieval people discuss intimate topics indirectly. The regional variations in meddler humor show how different cultures approach the same basic comedy. English meddler jokes tended to be more direct and crude, while French ones were often more subtle and literary. Italian meddler references were frequently romantic and poetic, while German ones were typically more earthy and practical. Each culture used meddlars to express their own particular brand of humor and social commentary. What's really striking is how meddler symbolism evolved over time. Early medieval references were often more straightforward and less sexually charged. But as the fruit became more culturally embedded, the sexual and romantic associations became stronger. By the late medieval period, medlars had become so associated with desire and aging that they were almost exclusively used as metaphors for life's fleeting pleasures. The modern loss of meddler cultural references means we've lost an entire vocabulary of medieval humor and symbolism. When modern people read Chaucer or Shakespeare, they often miss the meddler jokes entirely because the fruit is no longer part of our cultural knowledge. This represents a significant loss of literary and cultural understanding that affects how we interpret medieval and Renaissance texts. The meddler was a key to understanding medieval attitudes towards sexuality, aging, and the human condition. And we've basically lost that key. Now we're wrapping up our meddler story with what I think is the most fascinating part: how this weird fruit went from being absolutely essential to medieval life to basically disappearing from human memory. What absolutely blows my mind is how something that was literally mandated by kings and grown in every monastery suddenly became so forgotten that most people today have never even heard of it. We're talking about a complete cultural erasure of a fruit that was once as common as apples are today. The decline and disappearance of medlars tells us so much about how food culture can change and how we can lose entire traditions in just a few generations. The peak of meddler popularity was honestly incredible when you think about the scope of it. By the late medieval period, medlars were everywhere. Royal gardens, monastery orchards, peasant plots, and urban market gardens all featured these weird, rotting fruits. People knew how to grow them, store them, blet them, and prepare them in dozens of different ways. Medlars were so embedded in medieval culture that they appeared in literature, religious texts, cookbooks, and even legal documents. This wasn't just a fruit, it was a cultural institution. The beginning of the meddler's decline started with changing agricultural practices in the early modern period. As farming became more commercialized and focused on efficiency, medlars started to seem like too much work for too little reward. The fruit's complex ripening process and storage requirements made it less attractive to farmers who wanted crops that could be harvested and sold quickly. Why spend months carefully bletting medlars when you could grow apples that could be eaten right off the tree? The introduction of new fruits from the Americas and other regions also contributed to the meddler's decline. Potatoes, tomatoes, and various New World fruits offered flavors and nutritional benefits that were easier to obtain than medlars. These new foods didn't require the specialized knowledge and patience that medlars demanded. As global trade expanded, exotic fruits became available that were more appealing than weird local fruits that had to rot before you could eat them. The changing social attitudes toward food also played a huge role in the meddler's disappearance. As European society became more focused on refinement and sophistication, medlars started to seem crude and inappropriate. The fruit's sexual nicknames and associations became embarrassing rather than humorous. Victorian-era propriety couldn't handle fruits called open arse, so medlars were quietly removed from polite society. What had once been acceptable humor became socially unacceptable. The urbanization of European society was another major factor in the medlar's decline. As more people moved to cities, they lost connection with traditional food preservation techniques. Urban dwellers didn't have the space or knowledge to store medlars for bledding, and they didn't have access to the seasonal rhythms that made medlar cultivation possible. City markets preferred fruits that looked appealing and could be eaten immediately. Medlars, with their ugly appearance and complex preparation, didn't fit the urban lifestyle. The scientific revolution and changing understanding of food safety also contributed to the medlar's demise. As people learned more about bacteria and food spoilage, the idea of eating fruit that had to rot became less appealing. The medlar's bledding process looked too much like actual decay for comfort. Modern food safety principles emphasized freshness and visual appeal, both of which medlars completely failed to provide. What medieval people saw as sophisticated food preparation, modern people saw as dangerous and unsanitary. The loss of traditional knowledge was probably the most critical factor in the medlar's disappearance. As older generations died without passing down medlar cultivation and preparation techniques, the knowledge simply vanished. By the 18th and 19th centuries, few people remembered how to properly blend medlars, or when they were ready to eat. Without this specialized knowledge, medlars became inedible curiosities rather than valuable food sources. The economic changes of the Industrial Revolution also made medlars less viable. Mass production and distribution systems favored fruits that could be harvested, stored, and transported efficiently. Medlar's requirement for careful individual attention and specialized storage made them incompatible with industrial food systems. Commercial orchards stopped growing medlars because they couldn't compete economically with more efficient fruit crops. The cultural shift away from seasonal eating patterns was another nail in the medlar's coffin. Medieval people were accustomed to eating different foods at different times of year, and medlars filled an important winter niche. But as global trade made fresh fruits available year-round, people lost appreciation for seasonal specialties. Why wait for medlars to blend when you could buy fresh oranges from Spain or apples from storage? The modern rediscovery of medlars is honestly pretty fascinating and shows how food culture can come full circle. Heritage fruit enthusiasts and historical food researchers have been working to bring medlars back from near extinction. Some specialty orchards now grow medlars for adventurous eaters and people interested in historical cuisine. There's a small but growing community of people who are learning traditional medlar cultivation and preparation techniques. What's really interesting is how modern medlar enthusiasts describe the fruit's flavor and appeal. People who taste properly blended medlars often describe them as having a complex, wine-like flavor that's completely unique. The texture is often compared to fruit leather or concentrated applesauce. Modern tasters appreciate the medlar's uniqueness and historical significance, even if they find the appearance off-putting. The lessons from the meddlers' rise and fall are pretty profound when you think about them. We can lose entire food traditions in just a few generations if we don't actively work to preserve them. Cultural attitudes toward food can change dramatically, turning beloved staples into forgotten curiosities. The meddler story shows how modernization and efficiency can sometimes cost us diversity and cultural richness. The meddler's journey from royal tables to total obscurity is honestly one of the most dramatic food stories in European history. This weird fruit that required patience, knowledge, and a strong stomach was once central to medieval culture. Its crude nicknames, literary symbolism, and complex preparation methods made it a uniquely medieval phenomenon. Today, medlars exist mainly as curiosities for food historians and adventurous eaters willing to wait for their fruit to rot. The meddler story reminds us that even the most deeply embedded cultural traditions can disappear if we're no. Hey everyone, we're shifting into our second story tonight. And honestly, this one is going to completely change how you think about fast food history. We're diving into medieval cookshops, which were basically the McDonald's of the Middle Ages, except way more chaotic and probably more delicious. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how medieval cities developed these incredible street food cultures that would make modern food truck festivals look tame. We're talking about a time when buying ready-made food on the street was revolutionary, and the social impact was honestly massive. The rise of medieval cookshops was basically born out of pure necessity and urban chaos. Picture this. You're living in a medieval city, probably in a tiny room with no kitchen, working long hours as a craftsman or laborer. You can't exactly meal prep on Sunday like a modern influencer because you don't have a fridge, a proper cooking space, or even reliable access to ingredients. So enterprising food vendors started setting up stalls near busy market squares and city gates, offering hot, ready-to-eat meals. It was literally life-changing. What's really wild is how these cook shops became the beating heart of medieval urban life. They weren't just places to grab food. They were social hubs where people gathered, gossiped, and connected with their communities. The cookshop owners knew their regular customers, their preferences, and probably their entire life stories. It was like having a neighborhood restaurant where everyone was family, except the family included thieves, merchants, pilgrims, and whoever else happened to be passing through town. The strategic locations of these cookshops were absolutely brilliant. Smart vendors would set up near city gates where travelers were arriving hungry and tired. Others positioned themselves near busy market squares where merchants and shoppers needed quick meals. Some cookshops were located near workshops and guild halls, catering to workers who needed hot food during their breaks. The best locations could make or break a cookshop, and competition for prime spots was probably fierce. The variety of food available at medieval cookshops was honestly incredible. We're talking about meat pies, roasted meats, fish, hotcakes, bread, ale, and probably dozens of other dishes that we can only imagine. These weren't just basic survival foods. Cookshops offered legitimate cuisine that was often better than what people could make at home. Some vendors specialized in specific types of food, while others offered a full menu that could satisfy any craving. What really impresses me is how cookshops solved the urban food problem centuries before anyone understood urban planning. Medieval cities were growing rapidly, and traditional food systems weren't keeping up with the demand. Cookshops created a distributed food network that could feed large populations efficiently. They turned food preparation from a private household activity into a public commercial service. This was basically the birth of the restaurant industry, happening organically in medieval streets. The social dynamics around cookshops were fascinating and revealed so much about medieval urban life. Different cookshops served different social classes, with some catering to wealthy merchants and others serving common laborers. But there was also mixing that wouldn't have happened in formal dining situations. A noble passing through town might eat at the same cookshop as a carpenter, creating social interactions that were unusual for the time. The economic impact of cookshops on medieval cities was enormous. They created jobs not just for the vendors themselves, but for suppliers, food preparers, and support staff. Cookshops generated tax revenue for cities and contributed to the overall economic vitality of urban areas. Some cookshop owners became wealthy and influential members of their communities. The industry created opportunities for social mobility that didn't exist in traditional agriculture. The innovation that came out of cookshop culture was genuinely impressive. Vendors developed new cooking techniques, food preservation methods, and serving systems that maximized efficiency. They learned to prepare large quantities of food quickly, to keep food warm and fresh throughout the day, and to serve customers efficiently. Some cookshops developed signature dishes that became famous throughout the city. The competition drove constant innovation and improvement. What's really striking is how cookshops changed the entire rhythm of urban life. People could work longer hours because they didn't need to go home to cook. Travelers could stay in cities longer because they had access to reliable food. The urban economy became more dynamic because people had more flexibility in their daily schedules. Cookshops essentially enabled the modern urban lifestyle centuries before anyone knew what that meant. The cultural significance of cookshops went far beyond just food service. They became places where news was shared, business deals were made, and social connections were formed. Cookshop owners often served as informal community leaders and sources of local knowledge. The conversations that happened around cookshop tables probably shaped local politics and social movements. The international influence of cookshop culture was remarkable. Different cities developed their own cookshop traditions, but ideas and techniques spread along trade routes. Merchants would carry recipes and cooking methods from one city to another. This created a kind of medieval food globalization that influenced cuisine across Europe. Cookshops became cultural ambassadors that helped spread culinary traditions. Looking at medieval cookshops from a modern perspective, it's honestly amazing how advanced their business models were. They understood customer service, location strategy, menu development, and quality control. Many cookshops offered credit systems for regular customers and developed loyalty programs. Some even offered delivery services for wealthy customers. These medieval food entrepreneurs were pioneering business practices that we still use today. Now we're diving into the really gritty part, how cook shops became absolutely essential for medieval urban survival, and honestly, the social chaos that surrounded street food culture was both amazing and terrifying. What absolutely blows my mind is how these cook shops became the lifeline for medieval cities, especially for poor people and workers who literally couldn't survive without them. We're talking about a time when most urban dwellers had no kitchens, no cooking equipment, and no way to prepare their own food. Cook shops weren't just convenient. They were the difference between eating and starving for huge portions of the urban population. The social impact on poor and working class people was absolutely massive and honestly kind of heartbreaking. Picture this. You're a medieval laborer, living in a tiny room that's basically just a place to sleep. You have no fireplace, no cooking pots, no storage space for ingredients, and definitely no money to buy cooking equipment. Your entire food survival strategy depends on being able to buy ready-made meals from cook shops. If the cook shops in your area closed down or raised their prices, you were basically screwed. What's really fascinating is how medieval people developed this incredible food combining strategy. They'd buy different items from different vendors throughout the day, creating meals that were actually pretty sophisticated. Someone might buy a meat pie from one cook shop, bread from a baker, ale from a brewer, and cheese from another vendor. They'd combine these purchases to create balanced meals that met their nutritional needs. It was like medieval meal planning, except instead of grocery shopping, you were vendor hopping. The street eating culture that developed around cook shops was absolutely wild. Medieval people would literally eat while walking through the streets, standing in market squares, or sitting on random steps and benches. There were no restaurants with tables and chairs. People ate wherever they could find space. This created this incredibly vibrant street food culture, where eating became a public social activity. The entire city basically became one giant outdoor food court. But here's where things get really interesting. Medieval authorities were constantly trying to regulate cook shops because they were worried about food safety and public health. Cities developed elaborate laws about where cook shops could be located, what kinds of food they could sell, and how they had to prepare their food. There were rules about waste disposal, smoke from cooking fires, and even noise levels. Some cities required cook shop owners to get licenses and submit to regular inspections. The hygiene standards at cook shops were, well, let's just say they were inconsistent. The better cook shops maintained relatively clean operations and served safe food, but the cheap ones were often absolutely disgusting. Poor people who couldn't afford the good cook shops had to risk eating at places that served questionable meat, used dirty cooking equipment, and had basically no sanitation. Food poisoning was a real risk, but people ate there anyway because they had no other options. What's really striking is how cook shops created this whole informal economy of food service. There were vendors who specialized in preparing food for cook shops, suppliers who provided ingredients, and even people who cleaned up after the eating areas. Some cook shops employed servers, dishwashers, and food preparers. This created job opportunities for people who might not have been able to work in traditional crafts or agriculture. The reputation systems that developed around cook shops were surprisingly sophisticated. Word of mouth was everything. A cook shop that served bad food or got people sick would quickly lose customers. The best cook shops developed loyal followings and could charge premium prices. Some cook shop owners became local celebrities, known throughout the city for their signature dishes. Customer loyalty was earned through consistency, quality, and fair prices. The seasonal variations in cook shop offerings were incredible. During harvest time, cook shops would feature fresh vegetables and fruits. Winter menus focused on preserved meats and hearty stews. Religious fasting periods created demand for fish and vegetarian options. Cookshop owners had to be incredibly adaptable, changing their menus based on ingredient availability and customer needs. The social mixing that happened around cookshops was pretty remarkable for medieval society. While wealthy people usually ate in their own homes, they would sometimes buy from cookshops when traveling or conducting business. This meant that nobles, merchants, craftsmen, and laborers might all be eating the same food from the same vendors. Cookshops created rare opportunities for social interaction across class lines. The competition between cookshops was fierce and sometimes got pretty nasty. Vendors would try to undercut each other's prices, steal customers, and sometimes even sabotage competitors. The best locations were fought over, and established vendors would try to prevent newcomers from setting up nearby. Some cities had to create regulations to prevent cookshop wars from disrupting the entire food system. What's really wild is how cookshops influenced medieval urban planning. Cities started designing market areas specifically to accommodate food vendors. They created designated cooking areas, waste disposal systems, and even covered markets to protect vendors from weather. The success of cookshops proved that cities needed to plan for food service as an essential urban function. The gender dynamics around cookshops were fascinating. Many cookshops were run by women, often widows, who needed to support themselves. Food preparation was considered women's work, so cookshops provided economic opportunities for women that might not have existed elsewhere. Some female cookshop owners became quite successful and independent. But women also faced discrimination and harassment that male vendors didn't experience. The technological innovations that came out of cookshop culture were genuinely impressive. Vendors developed portable cooking equipment, efficient food storage systems, and serving methods that maximized speed and convenience. They learned to cook large quantities of food quickly, to keep food warm throughout the day, and to serve customers rapidly. These innovations influenced cooking techniques that spread throughout medieval society. Looking at medieval cookshop culture from a modern perspective, it's honestly amazing how they solved urban food problems that we still struggle with today. They created affordable, accessible food options for poor people, developed sustainable local food systems, and fostered community connections around shared meals. Medieval cookshops prove that street food culture isn't just about convenience, it's about creating social bonds and supporting urban communities. Now we're wrapping up our medieval fast food story with what I think is the most incredible part: the absolutely wild variety of food available at cookshops. And honestly, some of this stuff would make modern food trucks look boring. We're talking about a medieval food scene that was way more diverse and creative than most people realize. What absolutely blows my mind is how cookshop owners had to be incredibly innovative chefs, business managers, and food scientists all at the same time. The range of foods they offered and the clever ways they served customers created a food culture that was genuinely ahead of its time. The meat pie game at medieval cookshops was absolutely next level. We're not talking about simple pastries. These were elaborate constructions filled with different meats, vegetables, and spices that created complex, satisfying meals. Cookshop owners would make pies with beef, pork, chicken, fish, and sometimes exotic meats like venison or rabbit. The pastry crusts were designed to be both containers and eating utensils, creating the world's first edible packaging. Some pies were so large they could feed multiple people, while others were perfectly sized for individual meals. But here's where it gets really wild. Cookshops serve some absolutely bizarre foods that would shock modern people. Hot sheep's feet were apparently a popular snack, and I'm talking about actual sheep hooves that were cooked and served hot. Cow tongues, pig's ears, and various organ meats were common offerings. Medieval people weren't squeamish about eating parts of animals that modern people would find disgusting. Cookshop owners learned to prepare these unusual foods in ways that made them delicious and appealing. The fish offerings at cookshops were incredibly diverse and showed real culinary sophistication. Fresh fish, salted fish, smoked fish, and pickled fish were all available depending on the season and location. Cookshops near rivers would specialize in freshwater fish, while coastal cookshops offered ocean varieties. Some vendors developed elaborate fish stews that combined multiple types of seafood with vegetables and spices. The fish preparation techniques were often more advanced than what people could achieve at home. What's really impressive is how cookshops adapted to religious dietary restrictions. During Lent and other fasting periods, cookshops had to completely change their menus to offer acceptable foods. They became experts at preparing fish, vegetables, and dairy products in ways that satisfied customers who couldn't eat meat. Some cookshops specialized in fast-day foods and built their entire business around religious dietary requirements. This flexibility showed incredible business acumen and culinary creativity. The pastry and baked goods offerings were absolutely incredible. Cookshops served not just bread, but elaborate pastries, cakes, tarts, and sweet treats that were works of art. Some vendors specialized in luxury baked goods that competed with the finest products from professional bakers. Hot cakes, which were basically medieval pancakes, were served fresh and hot throughout the day. The variety of sweet and savory baked goods showed that cookshops were serving all types of cravings. The cheese and dairy offerings were surprisingly sophisticated. Cookshops served fresh cheese, aged cheese, butter, and various dairy-based dishes. Cheese flans, which were basically medieval quiches, were popular items that combined cheese with eggs and pastry. Some cookshops had relationships with local dairy producers and offered specialty cheeses that weren't available elsewhere. The dairy options provided protein and variety for customers who wanted alternatives to meat. What's really wild is how some cookshops offered customer customization services. People could bring their own ingredients and have them prepared by the cook shop staff. This was like having a personal chef service, where you provided the raw materials and the cook shop provided the expertise and equipment. Some customers would bring game they had hunted, fish they had caught, or vegetables from their gardens. Cook shops would prepare these ingredients using their professional cooking techniques. The beverage offerings at cook shops were equally diverse. Ale was the most common drink, but cook shops also served wine, mead, and various herbal drinks. Hot beverages like mulled wine and spiced drinks were popular during cold weather. Some cook shops made their own specialty drinks that became signature offerings. The combination of food and drink service made cook shops complete dining experiences. The seasonal specialties that cook shops offered showed incredible creativity and business sense. Spring menus featured fresh vegetables and young animals. Summer offerings included fresh fruits and light foods. Fall brought harvest specialties and preserved foods. Winter menus focused on hearty, warming foods that provided comfort during cold months. Cook shop owners had to be constantly innovating to keep customers interested. The portion sizes and pricing strategies were surprisingly sophisticated. Cook shops offered different portion sizes to accommodate different budgets and appetites. Small portions for children, regular portions for adults, and large portions for people doing heavy labor. Some cook shops offered combination meals that provided better value than buying items separately. The pricing was competitive but allowed for profit margins that kept the businesses viable. The quality control at the better cook shops was genuinely impressive. Successful vendors developed standards for ingredient quality, cooking techniques, and food safety. They learned to identify the best suppliers, maintain consistent cooking temperatures, and serve food at optimal freshness. The reputation of a cook shop depended on consistency, and the best vendors took quality seriously. The legacy of medieval cook shop culture is honestly amazing when you think about it. These vendors created the foundation for modern restaurant culture, street food scenes, and fast casual dining. They proved that quick, affordable food could be both delicious and socially valuable. Medieval cook shops showed that food service was a legitimate business that could support entrepreneurs and serve communities. Hey everyone, we're diving into our final story tonight. And honestly, this one is going to blow your mind because we're talking about eels as medieval currency. Yes, you heard that right. Fish money. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how eels became so valuable in medieval England that people literally paid their rent with them. We're not just talking about a popular food item. We're talking about a fish that was so economically important it appears in the Magna Carta and was used as official currency by the government. The story of medieval eels is honestly one of the weirdest economic phenomena in European history. The economic importance of eels in medieval England was absolutely insane. These slippery fish were so valuable that they were used to pay taxes, rent, and even legal fines. Landlords would literally accept eels as payment from their tenants, and the government would collect eels as part of their tax revenue. There are historical records of people owing hundreds or even thousands of eels to various authorities. Imagine getting a tax bill that says You owe the crown 500 eels. That was just normal medieval life. What's really wild is how eels became embedded in the official legal and economic systems. The Magna Carta, which is basically the foundation of English legal rights, specifically mentions eels in its provisions about weights and measures. This means that eels were so important to the medieval economy that they needed to be included in the most important legal document in English history. The fact that fish currency made it into a constitutional document shows just how central eels were to medieval society. The practical reasons why eels became so valuable are actually pretty brilliant. Unlike other fish, eels could stay alive for days or even weeks out of water if kept in damp conditions. This made them perfect for transportation and storage, which was crucial for a currency system. You could literally carry your money around in baskets, and it would still be alive and fresh when you needed to spend it. Eels were basically the medieval equivalent of cryptocurrency, a portable, durable store of value that couldn't be easily counterfeited. The abundance of eels in medieval England made them an ideal currency. Rivers, streams, and marshlands throughout the country were absolutely packed with eels. They were so common that almost anyone could catch them with basic equipment. This accessibility meant that eels functioned as a democratic currency. Poor people could literally fish their way to paying their taxes. Unlike gold or silver, which were controlled by the wealthy, eels were available to anyone willing to wade into a river with a net. The preservation techniques that made eel currency possible were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval people learned to keep eels alive in special containers, to smoke them for long-term storage, and to prepare them in ways that maintain their value. Fresh eels were worth more than preserved ones, but even smoked eels had standardized exchange rates. This created a complex pricing system where the same fish could have different values depending on how it was prepared and stored. The social implications of eel currency were honestly pretty democratic. Unlike monetary systems based on precious metals, which favored the wealthy, eel currency allowed common people to participate in the economy. A peasant who was good at catching eels could accumulate wealth and pay their obligations without depending on wealthy landowners. This created economic opportunities for people who might otherwise have been trapped in poverty. The regional variations in eel currency were fascinating. Different areas of England had different standard rates for eel payments. Some regions preferred large eels, while others valued quantity over size. The quality of local eel populations affected regional economies, with areas that had better fishing becoming wealthier and more influential. Eel-rich regions could essentially export their currency to eel-poor areas. The seasonal aspects of eel currency created interesting economic cycles. Eels were easier to catch during certain times of year, which meant that eel wealth fluctuated seasonally. People would stock up on eels during peak fishing seasons and use them throughout the year. This created a kind of seasonal banking system where people had to plan their finances around eel availability. The transportation networks that developed around eel currency were incredibly sophisticated. Merchants specialized in moving live eels between regions, maintaining the cold, damp conditions needed to keep them alive. Some areas became eel trading hubs, where people from different regions would come to exchange eels for other goods. The logistics of moving live fish currency required real expertise and infrastructure. What's really striking is how eel currency influenced medieval cooking and food culture. Since eels were constantly being transported and stored for economic purposes, people developed elaborate techniques for preparing them. Eel recipes became incredibly sophisticated, with different preparations for different social classes and occasions. The fact that your currency was also your dinner created a unique relationship between money and food. The quality control systems for eel currency were genuinely impressive. Authorities developed standards for eel size, freshness, and quality that had to be met for tax and rent payments. There were official eel inspectors whose job was to verify that payments met legal requirements. This created a regulated currency system that prevented fraud and maintained confidence in eel money. The international trade implications of eel currency were fascinating. English eels were exported to other countries, creating international exchange rates between eel currency and other monetary systems. Foreign merchants had to learn to deal with eel payments when trading in England. This created a kind of medieval foreign exchange market based on fish. Looking at medieval eel currency from a modern perspective, it's honestly one of the most successful alternative currency systems in history. It was democratic, accessible, practical, and stable for centuries. The eel economy supported thousands of people and enabled economic activity that wouldn't have been possible with scarce precious metals. Modern cryptocurrency enthusiasts could learn. Now we're diving into the absolutely wild religious and cultural significance of eels in medieval society. And honestly, this is where things get really weird, because we're talking about fish that were considered holy. What absolutely blows my mind is how medieval people convinced themselves that eels were somehow more pure and spiritual than other animals. We're looking at a time when the Catholic Church had very specific rules about what you could and couldn't eat during religious fasting periods, and eels managed to get classified as the ultimate holy food. The religious obsession with eels created a spiritual economy that was just as important as the monetary one we just talked about. The theological reasoning behind eel purity was honestly pretty creative and shows how medieval people could rationalize almost anything. Church scholars decided that eels were sexless creatures because nobody had ever observed them mating or reproducing. Since lust and sexual desire were considered major sins, the apparent absence of eel sexuality made them spiritually pure. This logic meant that eating eels during fasting periods wasn't just allowed, it was actually considered spiritually beneficial. Medieval people literally believed that consuming eels could help purify their souls. What's really fascinating is how this religious classification created a massive economic opportunity. During Lent, Advent, and other fasting periods that made up nearly half the medieval year, meat was completely forbidden. But eels were not just allowed, they were encouraged as the ideal fasting food. This created enormous demand for eels during religious seasons, driving up their value and making eel fishing incredibly profitable. Some people made their entire living from supplying eels to religious communities and devout lay people. The monastic communities were absolutely obsessed with eels, and their consumption was honestly incredible. Medieval monasteries would go through thousands of eels during fasting seasons. Monks developed elaborate eel recipes that turned these slippery fish into gourmet cuisine. Some monasteries had their own eel ponds and fishing rights, specifically to supply their religious dietary needs. The amount of time, energy, and resources that religious communities devoted to eel acquisition was absolutely massive. The mystery of eel reproduction actually played a huge role in their religious significance. Medieval people had no idea how eels reproduced because they never saw baby eels or observed mating behavior. This reproductive mystery made eels seem almost magical and otherworldly. Church scholars interpreted this mystery as evidence that eels were created through divine intervention rather than natural processes. The fact that eels seemed to appear spontaneously in rivers and ponds made them seem like miraculous creatures. The cultural symbolism of eels extended far beyond just dietary rules. Medieval people saw eels as symbols of resurrection because they could survive out of water for extended periods. Their ability to move through mud and survive in harsh conditions made them symbols of spiritual perseverance. Some religious texts used eels as metaphors for the soul's journey through earthly trials. The eel's slippery nature was interpreted as representing the difficulty of grasping spiritual truths. The pilgrimage culture around eels was absolutely remarkable. Certain rivers and eel fisheries became pilgrimage destinations where people would come to catch holy eels for religious purposes. Some religious festivals centered around eel fishing and consumption. These pilgrimage sites generated enormous economic activity and became important religious centers. The combination of spiritual significance and economic value made eel fisheries incredibly powerful and influential. What's really wild is how different social classes approached eel consumption during religious periods. Wealthy people would consume elaborate eel dishes prepared by skilled cooks, turning fasting into a kind of luxury experience. Poor people ate simple eel preparations, but still participated in the same religious tradition. This created a shared cultural experience that crossed class boundaries while maintaining distinct social differences. The medical and health beliefs surrounding eels were equally fascinating. Medieval physicians believed that eels had special medicinal properties because of their spiritual purity. Eel-based remedies were prescribed for various ailments, and eel oil was considered a cure for many diseases. The belief that pure foods produced pure health made eels a central part of medieval medical practice. Some people consumed eels not just for religious reasons, but because they believed it would improve their physical and spiritual health. The seasonal religious calendar created incredibly complex eel consumption patterns. Different fasting periods had different rules about eel preparation and consumption. Some religious seasons allowed only certain types of eel dishes, while others permitted more elaborate preparations. Religious communities had to plan their eel acquisition and storage around these complex seasonal requirements. The religious calendar essentially dictated the entire eel economy. The international spread of eel religious significance was remarkable. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, the religious classification of eels spread with it. Different regions developed their own eel-based religious traditions, and customs. Some areas became famous for their religious eel festivals and ceremonies. The spiritual significance of eels became a shared European cultural phenomenon. The artistic and literary representations of eels in religious contexts were incredibly rich. Medieval religious art often featured eels as symbols of purity and spiritual transformation. Religious texts included elaborate descriptions of eel symbolism and meaning. Some religious stories featured eels as characters representing virtue and spiritual strength. The cultural impact of eel religious significance extended far beyond just dietary practices. The conflict between religious eel consumption and practical economic needs created interesting tensions. Sometimes, religious demand for eels conflicted with their use as currency or trade goods. Communities had to balance their spiritual needs with their economic requirements. This created complex negotiations about eel allocation and use that affected entire regions. What's really striking is how the religious significance of eels influenced medieval understanding of nature and biology. The belief that eels were spiritually pure affected how people studied and understood aquatic life. Medieval natural philosophers spent enormous energy trying to understand eel reproduction and behavior. The religious classification of eels actually drove scientific inquiry and observation. This shows how religious beliefs could both limit and promote scientific understanding. Now we're wrapping up our medieval food mysteries with the most dramatic story of all, how King Henry I's obsession with eels literally changed the course of English history. What absolutely blows my mind is how one man's inability to control his appetite for these slippery fish triggered a civil war that lasted for decades. We're talking about a king who had survived countless battles, political conspiracies, and medieval dangers, only to be taken down by overeating the same fish that his subjects used as currency. The story of Henry I's fatal feast is honestly one of the most bizarre and consequential food-related deaths in human history. The background to this deadly dinner is absolutely crucial to understanding why it mattered so much. King Henry, I was the youngest son of William the Conqueror, and he had fought his way to the English throne through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and sheer ruthlessness. By 1135, he had been ruling England for over 35 years and had established a relatively stable kingdom. But here's the problem. His only legitimate male heir had died in a shipwreck years earlier, leaving the succession question completely unresolved. Henry had named his daughter Matilda as his heir, but medieval England wasn't exactly ready for a female ruler. The fatal feast happened in December 1135 at a hunting lodge in Normandy, and honestly, the details are both ridiculous and tragic. Henry had been warned by his physicians not to eat eels because they disagreed with his digestion. But the king was apparently so obsessed with eels that he ignored all medical advice and consumed what chroniclers described as a surfeit of eels. We're talking about a man who ate so many eels that his body literally couldn't handle it. Medieval accounts describe him becoming violently ill almost immediately after the meal. What's really wild is how the king's eel obsession was well known throughout his court. Henry I was famous for his love of eels, and courtiers would often bring him the finest eels they could find as gifts. The royal kitchens were experts at preparing eels in elaborate ways that pleased the king, but his physicians had repeatedly warned him that eels were dangerous for his particular constitution. The fatal feast was essentially the result of a king who thought he was above medical advice. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death was absolutely chaotic. Within hours of the king's death, news was spreading throughout England and Normandy that the succession was in crisis. Henry's nephew Stephen immediately claimed the throne, arguing that a woman couldn't rule England. Meanwhile, Matilda and her supporters insisted that she was the rightful heir as designated by her father. The stage was set for a civil war that would tear England apart for the next 2 decades. The civil war that followed became known as the Anarchy, and it was absolutely devastating. England was essentially split between supporters of Stephen and supporters of Matilda. Castles were built and destroyed, towns were burned, and thousands of people died in the fighting. The economy collapsed, law and order broke down, and the country descended into chaos. All of this because a king couldn't resist eating too many eels at one meal. The political implications of Henry's eel-induced death were enormous. If Henry had lived longer, he might have been able to secure Matilda's succession more effectively. He could have arranged political marriages, made key appointments, and eliminated potential rivals. But his sudden death left the succession question completely unresolved. The Civil War that followed fundamentally changed English political development and weakened royal authority for generations. What's really fascinating is how contemporaries interpreted Henry's death. Many saw it as divine punishment for his various sins and political crimes. Others viewed it as a warning about the dangers of gluttony and excess. Some chroniclers suggested that Henry's death was God's way of punishing England for its moral failings. The fact that he died from overeating a fish that was considered holy made the whole situation even more symbolically complex. The medical reality of Henry's death was probably acute food poisoning or a heart attack brought on by overeating. Medieval people didn't understand the dangers of consuming large quantities of rich, fatty foods. Eels are particularly high in fat and can be difficult to digest in large quantities. A man of Henry's age eating a massive amount of eels would have been at serious risk of digestive distress or cardiac events. The surfeit of eels was essentially a medieval case of fatal overeating. The long-term consequences of Henry's death extended far beyond just the immediate civil war. The anarchy weakened royal authority and strengthened the power of nobles and local lords. It led to the development of new legal and political institutions designed to prevent future succession crises. The chaos also affected England's relationship with continental Europe and influenced the development of medieval government. A single meal of eels literally changed the trajectory of English history. The cultural impact of Henry's death became part of medieval folklore and literature. Stories about the king who died from eating too many eels became cautionary tales about gluttony and excess. The irony that a king died from overeating a fish that poor people used as currency wasn't lost on medieval people. Henry's death became a symbol of how the mighty could fall through their own appetites and weaknesses. The economic implications were equally significant. The Civil War disrupted the eel economy, along with everything else. Trade networks collapsed, eel fisheries were abandoned, and the currency system based on eels became unreliable. The very fish that had killed the king became associated with political and economic chaos. This contributed to the gradual decline of eel currency in favor of more stable monetary systems. What's really striking is how Henry's death represents the intersection of personal choices and historical consequences. A king's decision to ignore medical advice and overeat his favorite food triggered events that affected millions of people. The personal became political in the most dramatic way possible. It's a perfect example of how individual actions can have massive historical consequences. Looking back at this incredible journey through medieval food mysteries, what strikes me most is how food was never just about sustenance. It was always about power, culture, and human connection. From the weird medlar fruit that had to rot before becoming delicious to the sophisticated street food culture that fed entire cities to the eels that served as currency and ultimately killed a king, medieval people created food traditions that shaped their entire world. These stories remind us that food has always been central to human civilization, driving innovation, creating social bonds, and sometimes changing the course of history. The next time you eat something unusual or enjoy street food, remember that you're participating in traditions that connect you to centuries of human creativity and cultural development. Sweet dreams, and thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through medieval food mysteries. These stories show us that even the most basic human needs can become sources of wonder, innovation, and historical drama.